some more once we get going.
Oh.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Robert Barton. I'll be hosting today's webinar. I'm here at North Carolina State University, and this webinar is the third in a series of webinars. This webinar is Removing Supply Chain Bottlenecks in the Sawmill Sector, Exploratory Analysis of Economic Benefits of Road Network Repairs on the Forest Sector in Mississippi. Our presenters today are Sean Tanger and Eric McConnell, and I will turn it over to Sean here in a second. Just real quick with logistics. If you have questions today, please click on the Q&A icon and you can enter those questions in as we go along. We will take questions at the end of today's presentation. And you also can find a copy of today's slide presentation on the Forestry page where you joined, and I will post that here shortly in the chat for you all. And with that, Sean, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Barton. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. Good to see everybody. And let me get my presentation shared here and we'll get this underway. Let's see, share that one. And is that working full screen?
It is.
Okay, let me. Sure, there we go. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for everybody for coming. This is kind of the capstone for a long project that we've done. We'll get more into those details as we go through the presentation, but I did want to point out the thanks to several of our colleagues and partners on the project. You'll see the logos there for some different institutions. Mississippi Forestry Commission really is at the top of that list in terms of guidance and help on things they thought would be necessary for important transportation questions that the logging sector was facing in the state of Mississippi and even broader across the Southeast. And really, these are it can be national issues as well. Infrastructure improvements and problems dealing with those they affect all 50 states. But it was really a joint effort. We had cross disciplines from engineering, forestry, myself down at the coast. I am a forester, but looking at everything from economics to optimization problems and things like that. Also, Dr. Michael Crosby at Louisiana Tech for his excellent work with the GIS software and analysis section. Lastly, I want to thank Swagata Treya, who was the master's student that really spearheaded most of this work. As I'm sure Dr. McConnell would support me on this, he was a very easy student to mentor, and a lot of times was way ahead of us on getting the work done. So really appreciate him as well. There are two prior presentations. If you're interested in this material, you might want to look at where we covered in depth the GIS results and the optimization results. In this presentation, we're really going to show you how we utilize those two pieces, those two big pieces of the project in order to get some cursory information on the actual economic impacts as we look through them through an input-output analysis. But those are available to you, as well as many training materials if you want to try to recreate some of the work that we've done here. And of course, we're happy to help you with email questions or phone calls and things like that if you get stuck or have more in-depth questions that you'd like to ask. And we'll have our contact information at the end of the presentation. So just some background here. Certainly timber harvest in the Southeast is quite important. There's many communities, many counties that, forestry might be the number one or number two industry in that particular county or locality. And so forestry, always those more rural areas is very vital. But as many of you know, if you're looking at these economic models, all this stuff is interrelated. And so those, the logging workforce, the logging sector, it has impacts upon many other sectors, and those other sectors impact upon it. So really, it's tied into this larger mosaic, this larger spider web of economic activity. But if it suffers in those rural regions, not only do those regions suffer severely, but it can also have spillover effects into much more populated regions that you might not think forestry is all that important. It definitely is. Um, timber harvest in the southeast, roughly 58% of it comes from private lands. And when we talk about timber harvest, this would be a broader metric across the U.S. In total, about 89% comes from private lands. And so wood being harvested on private lands taken to wood using mills is, for at least in the southeast, is a primary focus. And anything that interferes in that process, anything that slows down, retards, stops, or alters that supply chain is of critical importance for us as scientists, as well as forest stakeholders broadly. We have seen with a lot of the fires out west and the pine beetle up in Canada, and pine beetle some in the part of the Cascade area. We've seen a lot of sawmill capacity move to the southeast. Now, that's not just driven by those problems up there, although that is in part, there's labor concerns as well in those regions I mentioned. But we've also done a really good job of growing trees in the southeast United States, and those trees are now, in between ages of 25 and 35, large swath of them. And so we have a lot of sawmill quality or sawmill size lumber or wood product to make into lumber. And we've seen over the last 10, even 15 years, but really the last 10 years, we've seen a big rush of sawmill capacity increases in the southeast. And really in the last couple of years, maybe the last 5, it's really ramped up. And so why is that important? Well, again, back to my comment about the transportation issues. If new mills are looking at areas to come and build a mill, we always think, well, hey, there's plenty of trees there. The mill should be just fine, plopping down. But there's a lot of other concerns that they have, labor among those, wastewater treatment, those sorts of things. But really, transportation becomes paramount too. Once they've drilled in from a resource perspective, are there enough trees? One of the very next questions they start to ask is, can we get the wood from the sites to the mill, and can we do it easily and cheaply? If you don't know, the loggers are paid a delivered price by the mill, and the landowner is paid a stumpage price, typically from the logger. And so that difference between the delivered and the stumpage price typically is what the logger is going to keep. And the more and more we increase those transportation costs, which are we'll see shortly, are a large part of the overall cost of doing business as a harvester, a log harvester, it either is going to start to eat into their bottom line, or maybe worse, it's going to start to eat into landowners' bottom line in terms of prices that they can receive from those loggers to get that wood harvested off of their property and taken to the mill. So as I mentioned, around 40 to 45% of transportation costs, of logging operation costs, are transportation. So it's very important. In terms of overall harvest that takes place in Mississippi, the last statistics I looked at, we were in terms of softwood alone, which is the majority of it. These are typically pine species, around 30 million tons. And so I think around 15 of that is softwood sawlogs, and around 15 is pulpwood. Again, that's a rough approximation, but it's pretty close. And that varies, over from one year to the next. There may be fluctuations, but that's a fairly typical standard there. And you can see it has a tremendous impact on the overall economy. We don't have the numbers here. What we're looking at are those farm gates that I mentioned in terms of delivered and stumpage values. But if we include this very important piece of the supply chain into the larger forest economy, we're looking at roughly a 10 to $13 billion industry, depending on what the year is and how well the economy's doing. And so, forestry in Mississippi and the Southeast, just kind of using statistics like this to impress upon you the importance and kind of the valuation stakes that we deal. So one of the main things that we deal with in Mississippi, and this was from conversations we had with Mississippi Forestry Commission, is that in this supply chain process that I mentioned, taking wood from harvested site to a mill, uh, closed or posted bridges were a big problem. In fact, they identified that as one of the key transportation issues. Now, maybe not the number one. It depends on the person you talk to. Some people probably say insurance, other things like that. But certainly downed or out bridges really were they wanted to get a better handle on how much that was impacting the overall economy and logging industry particularly. So, nobody's really looked at this either at our state level. So we were working in Mississippi at the time. We had relationships with the Mississippi Forestry Commission. So we stayed focused on that. And what we wanted to do was get the process for conducting this research done at the state level, and then do these follow-up webinars so that people could then implement the same kind of study in nearby or any of the 50 states, really. Surprisingly, no one has really looked at the impact of outed bridges and how that can, as you can see in the graphic there, how that can increase what could be identified as the shortest possible route from a harvest site, that little green dot, to that mill, the kind of purple looking thing on the upper right corner there. And you can see that blue line would be your typical path that would be taken if that logger was trying to minimize the amount of miles they had to travel to get to that mill. So the best, quote unquote, best route. Well, we have two bridges there that are posted. They're not out completely, but there are weight limits. And so there are more steps to this process in terms of where the logger, if they start on a low weight, and they pass a road that, or get access to a road that they could get onto. So there are some rules there, and we did account for that in the modeling, but just from a simplistic perspective, looking at the differences here and how much further you have to travel from that harvest site to that mill, given that the truck would typically weigh 84,000 pounds loaded, can't go over those two locations. Okay. And so we wanted to get a handle on how much this goes on, how many miles are increased, how frequent it is, all of those aspects. And so there's a lot of details and things like that, as I mentioned, you can go back to the prior two presentations to get a better handle. But ultimately, that's what we're trying to look at here, is with those outages and that increased distance that logger now has to take from that harvest site to that mill. If we account for all of those steps, all those routes over an annualized period, what kind of cost are we looking at that are incurred from having to drive further distances? And those would be not just miles traveled, not just the miles traveled themselves for fuel, but wear and tear on vehicles, as well as what Dr. McConnell will talk about here shortly. So you can see there the outed or the closed or posted bridges. There's quite a few. According to National Bridge Inventory data from 2022, 6.5% bridges in Mississippi are actually structurally deficient. Another roughly 2,500 are posted to lower weight limits. And if you include Mississippi DOT's reports as well, out of around 5,800 state maintained bridges, there's another, roughly 500-600 that are either closed or posted. So there are a lot of bridges in Mississippi, a lot of waterways. So as a result, the Mississippi may be a little bit of a worst case scenario when compared to nearby states, but no better place to get a handle on the problem and try to figure out a way to quantify it. So without going, we could go back to the prior presentation that we did on the optimization model if you want to know more about it. But ultimately what we did is we ran an optimization model that quantifies these differences in the routes here. And we looked at those and compared them as different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we assume there's no posted bridges, really only trying to get an idea of if the bridge system's perfect, how much cost are there included for transporting wood from the harvest site to the mill. And then scenario 2, we add those limits in and we see what that number is and then compare the two differences. So fairly straightforward in terms of the scenarios, the mathematics. Thanks to the engineering department, the mathematics I did not find simple, but they did seem to struggle with it. So good to have those partners. A quick result from that work. Around 25% of the identified shortest routes connecting the sites to the mills had restricted bridges on them. And if we're looking at it from the mill's perspective, because many, in the way the model worked, we would allow within reasonable limits, we would allow harvest site to go to one or choose amongst a couple of mills. So what we found is the mill might have 2 or 3 harvest sites sending wood to it. So around 37% of the mills, if we look at it from that perspective, experienced increased transportation costs as well. And so again, those are mill problems to a degree, because if the delivered price is a set price for them and the loggers can't make it work to bring wood to their mill from that harvest site, then guess what? That wood's not going to go that route. And so if the condition gets bad enough, it certainly does become the mill's problem to some degree or another. In terms of the overall outcomes, we had about a 4.7% transportation cost increase, counting to about 34 cents a ton. And you can see there the increase in overall typical prices for this transportation on a per ton or on a per load basis, that 835, 869. All in all, if we include all of the harvest sites to all the mills, and again, these were just for the softwood sawmills, so we didn't include pulpwood, we didn't include hardwoods, and economically, the hardwoods are going to be a smaller percentage, but still would need to be looked at. But due to the mills coming in, due to the increased economic activity for softwood sawmills, we thought that would be a good place to start. You could see around $4 million in added cost difference based on the sample that we had. And we did have to use FIA data to serve as our harvest sites. And of course, there are many more than those. So we would need to do some follow-up research to figure out how that might change the overall results. The overall tonnage that's taken to the mill, or that the mill is going to need, is accounted for. So in that way, the numbers would not change. So we're still, in our model, we still are fulfilling the demand at the mills with the sites we have, and then some what we call shadow supply. And so from that perspective, the numbers would change, but we had roughly 30, I think 35 sites, harvest sites. And, in reality, it would probably be several hundred, depending on the year that was under investigation. So we would want to look at that again and rerun that analysis just to compare the two. So we might get slightly different numbers there, but I wouldn't think super large, but again, that's a speculation.
Hey, Sean,
Yeah.
I just want to point out another result that we should have put on that page was the average difference in distance was 4.5 miles.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And there was quite a bit of, as many of you listening might imagine, quite a bit of variation. One or two of those routes were, the picture that I showed you earlier, you could get over 20 or 25 miles in some cases. But yeah, and then some were minuscule, was half a mile kind of thing. So there was a lot of variation in that as well. So the question becomes then, how do we take this data where we've gotten our increased cost from these different distances that are traveled for softwood sawtimber log trucks, and try to determine how that cost then filters its way through the broader economy? And we also wanted to add in a little extra piece. The models that we use actually account for some environmental components now too, and because that's been a lot more important here lately in terms of funding from federal agencies and things like that, we thought it was good to go ahead and start that conversation as well. But you can see here, this problem is not just closed off to Mississippi. This is a recent article from the Arkansas Forestry Association, and they're actually trying to identify repairs and replacements for bridges within Arkansas. So this problem is not going away. It's going to continue to be an issue, and will have to be addressed in some fashion. So how do we do that? How do we take that data from our optimization model and our GIS work that we did and run it through and see how it affects the economy? Well, lucky for us, there is a modeling system out there that we don't have to create ourselves. Many of you probably familiar with InPlan, or you might have heard input-output models in the past. But in short, what these do is they track the interlinkages of industries and businesses. So if we have a new mill added, for instance, how many jobs is that going to add? What's the what's the increased incomes going to be in the area, and how does that new business impact the other businesses within that region and surrounding regions? The cool thing about it is it also adds in responses from household spending, labor requirements. So now these new businesses would need laborers, households provide labor, and institutional purchases or sales. So things like state and federal government facilities in that state, how might they be impacted by this new mill that was built, for instance? And then imports and exports that exist, either that mill or the industries that supply that mill, or the mill itself drawing in materials from outside of the economic region, or sending out finished products or intermediate products as well. And the InPlan system has built up over time as the NAICS codes that they utilize, which the federal government collects, and they use basically your tax forms to determine that what your business is if you're operating in business. And they build all that up. They build essentially a giant spreadsheet to show all the interactions going on between these different industries, these different households and institutions, et cetera. And they utilize multiple data sets, either at the federal, state, county, zip code, or even smaller region. And so pretty complicated model. There are some publicly available ones that are a little more simplistic, but they don't get at some of the things that we like to look at in terms of those import exports and this environmental data. So how does the model actually present the results? Well, we have these three areas: direct, indirect, and induced effects. A direct effect, let's say, so for an industry like a sawmill or a pulp and paper mill, a direct effect might include sales of its products or changes in inventory. So where that lumber or that other products are going and being sold, and if they haven't sold any, if they still keep it on in their inventory, that still is valued. The indirect effects, so that's the sawmill is going to draw in things like electricity and transportation services that it's going to use, but are not core to its business, in the sense that they're not the ones, they're not the business creating those, right? They're farming those out to other firms, other industries. And then the induced effects would typically be things like your employees from that sawmill, the purchases that they go and they make in that local regional economy where they live and work and things like that. So you would get additional impacts from those salaries that those workers earn as they go out and purchase things, so on and so forth. The major categories that we look at once we run one of these InPlan analyses or these input-output analyses, we'll get those direct, indirect, and induced effects for all four of these categories. We don't always report all of these because we may not need them for the project we're doing, but it reports things like employment. And again, that's just number of full and part-time jobs. So if you see a partial one and they didn't cut a person in half and count them as an employee, it's just trying to get an idea of how much work there is. Labor income, So employee wages and benefits plus proprietor income. Value added is kind of the one we're really keenly interested in as economists. It's really the GDP that business that's going to come to the economy, how much it creates, it adds to. And then industrial output, which is a total of production, which is going to include that value added, as well as a couple of other items. You should see them there. Yeah, so you can see industrial output. It would be the value added that the business creates, as well as intermediate inputs that are created. So you don't get to count those in your business. If you create cars, you don't get to count tires that you buy from a tire company. Those would be split off as intermediate inputs. Otherwise, we would have extra counting and double counting, things like that. We don't want it for the purposes in order to be accurate. But you can see what that overall output number encompasses, and how each of those subcategories fit together. So for input-output analysis, or the in-plan analysis, as most people know it as, we use those terms interchangeably. They're not quite, but it's fine for the presentation. Again, we're going to determine total impacts on an economy, and it's going to have those split outs that we've mentioned for the 4 categories and 3 types of effects. It does assume that these relationships are constant. So you will have to go in and do some tweaking yourself, which you can still with their online model. If you want to change those, I think you still can. I know you could in the old system, and it provides a snapshot. So there's not if you want to see what the long-term effects are over the next 10 years, then that's really not what the model is going to be able to do for you. It's going to give you a kind of an annualized, one shot kind of deal. The other aspect is, depending on whether you're talking about adding a business, or if you want to alternatively look at subtracting a business, it's going to give you the best or worst case scenario of those 2 things. And I like to think of it in terms of a spider web. So say we closed a sawmill and we wanted to see what the impact would be. Well, you take that mill out, you take all of the employment, all of the labor income, et cetera, out. And the in-plan model doesn't know that you want it redistributed throughout the rest of the economy, right? So those people that got laid off from the sawmill, they probably found jobs nearby in other industries in that region or in nearby regions. But just the in-plan analysis alone tell you that. It just show you the impact of closing the mill. So it's basically like punching a hole in that web right there. Whereas we know in reality that web, once that hole gets punched, that web might not look the exact same, but it would thread back together in some way, right? New linkages would be created to replace the lost ones. They may not match up, but they would still mitigate that effect to it. And lastly, there's single point estimates. So whatever numbers you punch in, if you punch them in 50 times, you're going to get the exact same number back that you would the first time. And so there's really not that aspect of randomness that occurs, right? What if what if the estimation's wrong? What if it's off by 10%, 20%, so forth? You're not going to pick that up. It's just going to spit out a number, and it'll keep spitting out the same number until you go in, and you'd have to go in and alter some of the underlying data to get different outcomes. Or you can do what Dr. McConnell did, which he'll talk about here shortly. So last, I've mentioned this, putting all this together, things that you need to think about things you need to consider if we're going to try to do a particular project. I mentioned the mill closure, things that you would need to consider. But the main idea here is these are net changes that we're trying to get a handle on, that are created by a singular occurrence. And so one time only annual impact that's going to occur. And if you want to know how that's going to affect next year, then you're going to have to run the model for the following year when the new data comes out to see what its impact would be. It would give you that intertemporal. So we do see a butterfly effect, so to speak, but only spatially, not temporally. last slide for me here. This is something both Eric and I are kind of new to in terms of trying to utilize it, but InPlan has since added, since they went to their online cloud system, has added a extension for environmental data. And so you can see here they've utilized the US EPA's input-output extension for environmental models. And today we'll talk a little bit about greenhouse gases. So once we ran all of the economics on this, or looked at the impacts economically, we also were able to go in and grab some of the environmental impacts from these trucks now having to drive further distances. And they're not trivial. It's interesting stuff. But I'll beg off going into any more depth than that just for the sake of time, and we'll hand it off to Dr. McConnell. Hey, you're muted.
There we go.
Your screen's not sharing right now. You want me to just
know what's happening. I'm very sorry.
I can reshare mine if you have too much issue.
I am having technical difficulties. I promise it worked.
You want me to just reshare mine?
Yeah, reshare yours and we'll go from there. I greatly apologize for that.
No, you're good, man. Stuff happens.
And so
let me switch here. Sorry, hold on. Flip these. There you go.
Okay. Again, everyone, I apologize greatly for that. It worked fine prior to 12 noon. But what Swagat found in his thesis project was an average difference of $4 million. And so to run the economy-wide part of the analysis, we had to figure out, well, how is that extra $4 million, where are those costs going to? And so they're going to the various portions that it takes to run the truck. Obviously, employing the trucker is one, and then what it takes to operate the truck. And so what we looked at specifically were the variable cost involved in hauling the extra mileage. And so the categories on the top table, that came from the Route Chaser program that we put together a user video for, and it was on the second presentation in our three-part series, if you want to take a look at that. And so the economic impacts are based purely on the variable cost, because the fixed cost would be paid throughout the year, irregardless. And so the $4 million, it broke out according to those percentages. And so we used the average column of cost to develop the analysis that we're presenting to you today. But using statistical resampling with replacement, we were able to basically recreate individual replicates. You know, if you think about drawing numbers from a hat, I draw a number, I put the number back in the hat, and I recreate one sample. And then I do that hundreds or thousands of times. And we actually did it 1,000 times. And so it gives you an idea of the variation that could be present in our results. And so the extra fuel cost, diesel cost, we found an average of 1.97 million, but again, depending on adding variation to the results, it could be as little as 500,000 more extra, up to almost 3.5 million, because remember that average haul distance, the difference was 4.5 miles. And so there's a deviation around that. It went from 31.3 miles to 35.8 miles. That was the results that we found. And then, so this is how we split up the use of the truck in the top portion. So diesel, brakes, and tires, and then major maintenance and minor repair. That comes from the Route Chaser program. And then what's unique here is that we had to margin those values out. We assume that the fuel, even though fuel depots are becoming more commonplace in the South, we assume that they purchase diesel from from a local fueling station. And then brakes and tires they buy from a retailer. And so there's a margin for the tire manufacturer, a margin for the freight mover, the trucking company, to move the tires from the tire plant to the retail store, and then the retailer is going to get a slice of the pie as well. And so we had to split that out. The bottom table is based on partly on the in-plan data, how it splits employee payments and proprietor owner payments. But the industry portion between logging and trucking, that is from a colleague's work, James Shannon, who is an extension forestry specialist here at MSU. He's conducting research on the log trucking industry. And his survey found that companies that identify as contract truckers and then firms that have their logging business and their trucking business as separate companies. And so the contract truckers and then those companies that are separate within firms amounted to 19% of his total respondents. And then 81% of his respondents that own trucks, the logging side and the trucking side were weaved together as one company. Next, please, Sean. Thank you. And so the top portion of the table, again, that just summarizes the disaggregated costs that we showed earlier by categories. And so when you run the economy-wide effects, just based on the added cost to the logging sector, we see that the average went from just a $4 million difference up to $5.12 million. And so the input-output model, for those of you that are familiar with land expectation value, and so land expectation value is the sum of those infinite number of rotations, future of net values. The input-output model works very similarly. You have a first round of spending, a second round of spending, a third round, and the dollars just keep turning over until they all eventually leave the economy, because I'm purchasing from another state or another country. And so in effect, you're importing. So my dollar is being paid outside of my study region. And so again, the input output, it works very similar to that Faustman formula for LEV. Now, the middle portion, that is the gross. And so, based on the added cost to the loggers and the truckers. And so what we saw was that for every dollar or every $1 million that were added in cost to the log truckers, that multiplier of 1.25 means that $250,000 in cost, in production cost, were added to other industries to help meet the logger's ability to haul the wood that extra distance. Now, the net difference, and this was our assumption in this analysis, was that, you know, the added, well, what if the money we save by instead going the shortest route, that money accrues to the employees and the business owners. And so they are able to save that extra money and reinvest in the company. And what we saw there, if you look at the average on the bottom portion of the table, it's actually a little lower than the average at the top portion of the table. And so by offsetting that, you know, if we are able to curb the extra cost, we can at least muffle the multiplier effects across other industries. And so while ideally we would love to have the bridges repaired and be able to run at 88,000 pounds, if it, you know, at minimum, you know, we can reduce that multiplier effect, that's a good thing. And so again, the results average 5 million, but they could get as high as just over $9 million when you account for not just the loggers and truckers, but all the other industries that are touched by those dollars in spending. And so, and again, this is just for the pine saw logs, which is 50% of the Mississippi timber harvest. But when you think about these bridges, every industry is impacted by these bridges. And so, you know, we're really identifying a smaller part, but it's a bigger problem that impacts all of us. And so that's the important thing, is that, you know, by saving that dollar, and if we're able to reinvest in the company through not just physical capital, the equipment, but the human capital, their employees, we can work to offset that impact. And so how do those differences break out? And so this is looking at the gross. And so just assuming that all the added costs are borne by the loggers. And so again, the supply chain, that indirect impact, is an additional $1 million in total. And so the 10 jobs, you know, is relatively small, but, you know, when you scale these results across all timber products, across all agricultural products, you start to see it really expand. And so here's how the impact, you know, if we were to assume that those costs could be offset, we would see that $1 million, and that goes right back into the local economies. And so that's the important thing here about the cost, or the changes in labor cost. That money, yes, some of it is saved at the bank, but the bank is going to turn around and loan that maybe to a neighbor to purchase a new vehicle. That money's spent in the grocery store or at the local insurance agent. And so those induced effects, those are the most local of all of these, because it's people spending money in their everyday lives. And so what we see here is those induced effects, and Sean mentioned it earlier, the key value that you know, science guys like we look at is the value added. And when you compare that to just the gross effect, we've cut it by almost half. And so that's very important as well, that the net effect of that, it's helping buffer how the economy is truly impacted across all those supply chains. And so here's the new part that we're in the science community. It's kind of the engineers and the economics people working together. And so what we focused on here is something that there's a lot of different chemicals out there, and I'm definitely no chemist. It was my weakest subject, but we're just going to focus on a few that everybody is familiar with, and that's the greenhouse gases. And so again, with the input-output model, what we're looking at here in the environmental, that's the economy-wide environmental impacts just from the extra miles driven, that extra 4.5 miles. And to give some perspective to that, in Mr. Atreya's thesis project, he found that average 4.5 mile distance over the course of the year, it would take an additional 12,400 loads to meet the pine sawmill demand in the state. Because of the extra miles driven, you're not getting as many loads per day, and so you're losing productivity. And so what we see as far as the industry-related emissions, carbon dioxide, the main driver of the climate as we've come to know it. And so 821,000 kilograms or 821 metric tons. And the other chemicals that registered some noticeable values were methane and the nitrous oxide. And then there were a number of other chemicals in minute quantities. And then you see from the labor spending related emissions, again, a smaller total, and again with carbon dioxide. And so it's not just emissions from the trucks, it's emissions from the plant to generate electricity, to generate steam, and other types of energies that we need to produce the goods and services to move them from the manufacturer to the retailer and then to the end user.
Yeah, and I'd just like to point out, these are all production related. So any environmental data that InPlan provides is due to impacts from production changes. And so the carbon dioxide that you're seeing here is carbon dioxide that gets increased production because of making new tires, making brakes, so on. It doesn't include over road miles that the truck itself is engaged in. So we would have to, if we wanted to do a holistic greenhouse gas emissions, we would have to figure out what, and I'm sure this data exists, figure out what logging trucks produce in terms of their emissions and multiply by the number of miles and add it to these data.
And so, we were able to effectively get a first number and more importantly, a first set of numbers. And so we only presented the averages here, but again, as Dr. Tanger pointed out, is that, a number into the software, it's going to give you a number out. And so, we were able to use Excel to develop distributions. And so we're able to see a range of impacts that could happen. And another key thing is, it's not just the the gross aspect. And so when you read these reports, oftentimes you'll just see the gross, and the analyst at a flaw in their analysis is they're failing to account for the trade-offs. And so we use the example unemployment. Yes, people may lose their job, but they'll also qualify for unemployment benefits. And so what we had to assume here was, the additional cost are going to be offset by some extent through portions of income and value added. And so what we found was the economy-wide aspect, across all rounds of spending at the average would exceed $5 million. And so a multiplier of 1.25. And so we found that, there's a number of environmental metrics that we can investigate. And for the forest sector in particular, being a quote unquote extractive industry, removing the timber from the stump that is connected to the soil makes us an extractive natural resource industry. And so there's a host of environmental impacts that we as an industry have across our county, our state, our country, and the world. And so beginning a conversation around those ecosystem and environmental data is really going to add a new light to analyses such as this.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in terms of and it may change, here next year, but a lot of the bureaucratic agencies with respect to grants and funding sources and things like that are now requesting, measures beyond just the pure economic numbers. So environmental issues, equity issues, things like that, or if there's a bridge that's down in a really poor community versus a wealthier one, right, that might get a bit of a higher ranking in terms of priority. But for forestry generally, if we're going to help, the whole purpose of the project was to try to use this to help leverage funds for Mississippi DOT and the Forestry Commission from the US DOT and other agencies to help actually get bridges repaired. And they were telling us all along that these were measures that they need to really be effective in the granting process. And so we kind of have to push the ball forward on including those. And but we have to be careful with them as well. We don't want to let that has to be a smaller component, but still a component nonetheless in the work that we do as we try to pull some of these funds from the federal coffers.
And so we'd like to thank a number of people. Swagata Treya, who graduated with his Master of Science degree from Mississippi State this past December. He's now a PhD student at Oregon State University in their Department of Forestry. The USDA Forest Service, the Landscape Scale Redesign Program for funding this project, the Mississippi Forestry Commission, who provided their support for us to even get our hat in the ring for competition. Mississippi Department of Transportation, Chad Miller and Josh Sullivan, they were advisory members of the project, and they helped a lot as well. And so it's been a very interesting project, but the environmental data in particular is something that I think is going to add an interesting twist to analyses like that, or like this, that you're starting to see us in forestry report more on the economic importance and how we rank to, automobile manufacturers, chemicals, etc. But, acknowledging, what wood and forestry can do. So while we're producing emissions and environmental outputs, we're also able to store them as well. And so I think it's going to add a great chapter to our story and being able to tell our story.
Agreed. Yeah, and one last person, we put Mississippi DOT there, Jessica Dilly with Mississippi
Dilly,
DOT. Yeah, I forgot to put her name, but she was real helpful and provided us a lot of data that it wouldn't have been possible to even get this done without her. So yeah, it was definitely a group effort, and we really appreciate all those people for chipping in where they could to help us. And so that wraps up the presentation portion. I think we still have a few minutes. So if there's questions, I think we got a couple coming in here.
So one question came in through our chat, and that is it possible to assess the number of trips they could make in different routes?
Yes. And so what we looked at was, if you look at the earlier slide, the shortest route, that was identified in using ArcGIS and the Dijkstra algorithm. So if you watch part 1 of this series, and then part 2, we identified the shortest route based upon not being able to access the blue route because of the bridge. And so from that added distance, we can then we can use Route Chaser as one particular tool to estimate how many loads we can get a day. And we can set that to an 8-hour day, a 10-hour day, whatever option a company desires. And it will give you a daily cost. It'll give you a per ton cost as well as a per ton mile cost. And so, yeah, you can estimate the number of trips.
Yeah, and in terms of road maintenance, that's a great question. So there is data in the spreadsheets that we were given from Mississippi DOT on just how structurally sound the bridge is. And so if we had some traffic data and we had those data, we could potentially, if we were trying to prioritize which bridges to get repaired, right? That's the obvious next question that people ask. Well, which bridges should we work on? And the road maintenance costs would factor into that. The problem with that is some of these communities, they know they're not going to have funding to fix a bridge, or they think it's going to, be a long time. They'll post the bridge even if it's still fine to go over. That's not a decision that's made by Mississippi DOT. It's made by the county, as far as what I've been told. And so you have a little bit of as I do my sarcastic air quotes, preventative maintenance.
Yes. And the state sets it. And so looking at the Mississippi State Code, the county supervisors can lower it from what the state sets it at.
Yeah.
But hopefully we were able to explain it clearly. But the two factors again were the added cost of going. Sean, can you show one of the early screen with the Hermanville? You don't have to put it in presenter mode or anything, but the blue route and the red route.
There.
Yeah. And so the economic impact analysis, the added cost for the logger / trucker was based on the red route. Okay. And then the offset or the trade-off to that to get the net effect, we said, well, what if they could go the blue route And instead of spending that extra money on wear and tear on the truck and extra labor cost, if they still desire to get that 3 loads a day, they might have to pay a little extra. Well, instead, if we could go the blue route, that money is going to accrue to income and value added. So that's money that can stay in our pocket. We can reinvest in our equipment, our human capital. So additional trainings and such for our employees. And so that's how we develop the gross impact and then the net effect to balance them out.
Do we have any other questions for our presenters today?
Feel free if as you think things through, to reach out to us by email or by phone. Email's probably easier. Easy searches. I'm at tanger@uamont.edu. And Dr. McConnell, you can find him pretty easily online.
And if you don't have time to watch the videos, the Route Chaser tool that I mentioned, if you just go to a search engine and type in MSU FWRC, FWRC stands for Forest and Wildlife Research Center. Go to that, and then you'll click on the software tab. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see Route Chaser there. It's a free download. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and you can click on the tabs. It's very user friendly. We made a video to demo it for you with the data that we used in this analysis. But it's very easy to learn, and you can put your own company's data in there, or you can put, if you're a forester and you work with loggers, you can put some best guesses in there, and you can help estimate trucking costs, if you're a consulting forester, and try to figure out, where a landowner's reservation price needs to be.
And you can find that tutorial. I just posted the link to the second webinar. So if you were to click on that link or copy that link, it would take you to the portal page for that second webinar where the tutorial for Route Chaser is. So. All right, it's just after 2 o'clock. Great job, guys. I do appreciate you taking the time to do the webinar and everything. Great material, great information and everything. This webinar, as I indicated at the beginning, was being recorded, so it will be available for future viewing. All you have to do is go back to the portal where you joined today, and you'll have a chance to be able to view it again if you so wish, or if you want to share it with somebody. That's always appreciated. And with that, I'll bring today's webinar to an end. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.